Welcome to the Leading Movement Health Series. I'm your host, Phil Wagner, founder and CEO of Sparta Science. Today, super excited to have Tim Szymanski, retired Vice Admiral in the US Navy. And Tim last served as a Deputy Commander of the US Special Forces Command. And prior to that, he was a Commander of the US Naval Special Warfare Command, also known as, or at least a lot of that command is comprised of the Navy SEALs and special boat teams. And when he graduated from the US Naval Academy, he went on to serve on SEAL Team 2 and also with Development Group, which is also known as SEAL Team 6. So Tim is known as a powerful advocate for the health of special operations warriors, especially focused on brain health. One of the reasons I'm excited to chat with Tim is he established policy that cognitively baseline the entire special operations community. It's not an easy task with these type A operators to actually start doing that type of interventions. And so he went on to start creating initiatives that focus on developing and maintaining positive mental health practices while really promoting and raising awareness around this issue of brain health. So Tim, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Phil. Thanks to Sparta, and really thanks for the opportunity to speak with you and your audience today.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the reasons I'm excited is when we talk a lot about health, a lot of times it gets reduced down to musculoskeletal injuries. But, your passion and certainly an interest of ours is, health, a big part of that is the cognitive piece. It's not just physical. They certainly feed each other. But why is this brain health? Why is it so important to organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in special operations and special forces, communities around Special Operations Command, or from here on out, I'll call SOCOM. We've had a huge aspect or huge focus on performance, human performance. All right, and there's a whole sort of money line in our budget that's around human performance. And over the years, that's really been about how do we eke out more performance from each individual. And largely, that's really has been, as we have a soft truth that humans are more important than hardware. That's really about the human performance, and largely that has consistently been about physical performance. Right, and being able to persevere and reaching your max potential, but really this aspect of also, we're asked to do a lot of things and with some high risk operations, and there's a lot of injuries. So this really started about return to duty, right? And then after return to duty, in the early 2000s, it was about okay, how do we prevent injuries? How can we get in front of? How can we do preventative to prevent injuries? Not only the return to duty, but return to duty faster. How do we, extend a soldier, a sailor, or Marine's career by preventative treatment and preventative maintenance? And that was great until about 2010, right? I mean, we are at the cutting edge of human performance on rehab, prehab, and sustainment.
Yeah, and one of the things you keyed in on there, right, is human performance and trying to eke that out. And I think what's interesting is when you talk about these timelines, you almost see the same thing with the NFL, where you're eking out performance, and then starting in 2010, you're saying, wait a minute, like we've got some longevity issues in retention of NFL players, but we've also got that with SOF operators.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and the silent the clause that we didn't mention there is then what is the quality of life post career or post sports career, right? Based on whether it's physical, mental, or cognitive, what is the quality of life for those performers after they're done with their careers. And to your point, I think, it was really important for us to kind of understand, well, you can only get, there's only so much you can physically do, right?
Right.
And so where else can we get gains, both in quality of life, not quality of life as a sidebar to that, but where do we get gains in performance in their current role.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people don't recognize the cognitive requirements of a special operator. I know for myself, first time visiting development group, people asked, "Oh, how physical were they?" And I said, honestly, the most amazing part was how strong they are mentally, right? The resilience that's required, to perform the duties in the ass, and therefore brain health, right, becomes so critical to not only prepare but also recover from the duties that are being asked of a special operator.
Yeah, I think brain health is the I don't want to say it's the uncharted, because I would like to say we started charting that, but it's the least explored, right? And that comes down to this nexus of invisible wounds, whether it's post-traumatic stress or, and I don't know if we'll get into it on here, Phil, and the time allowed, for some of the repetitive head injuries that we've talked about, impact, but also this new phenomenon with not new, but newly understood phenomenon of low-level repetitive blast injury, and a lot of that comes from training, just like it does, with CTE and contact sports, and how that affects people cognitively, emotionally, mentally. This is this area. So this your aspect of going to development group and understanding how mentally tough. I think all our special operations forces have these programs in their selection and training that they're selecting for toughness, also adaptability, creativity. But I separate mental toughness and resilience a little bit, because sometimes the taboos of the military on things like suicide and trauma and all sometimes hold us back in fully understanding our full potential in human performance.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about the physical side, I think a big focus on that is because you can measure it. And one of the key aspects that you implemented, right, is a policy to start cognitively baselining, right? Actually start measuring, these aspects of, what was formerly uncharted, but now it's starting to be explored, brain health. So talk a little bit about how, you went about establishing and bringing awareness to the policy of putting those types of baseline measurements in place.
Yeah, this is kind of the pivot point for me in my career, and why this became important. And when I was in Naval Special Warfare Commander in 2016 to 2018, a good friend of mine and a man you probably should interview at some point is Frank Larkin. Frank Larkin was a former SEAL. He was the Sergeant Master at Arms of the Senate recently, during just prior to the January 6th Capitol sort of riot there. But Frank was also an FBI agent, was in the World Trade Center when the World Trade Center went down. Frank started getting into this when he was also the head of JIETA, the Joint Improvised Explosive piece that the military put together, under Secretary of Defense Gates during when the Iranians started supplying electronically formed projectiles to in Iraq to the insurgents, and that became a wicked weapon against the U.S. military and the coalition, if you will. And so the EFPs and they started kind of looking at what the damage of how do we get after this network. So Frank was really involved with this for a long time. But Frank's son was a SEAL. It was an all-star SEAL, and started having issues. Frank's son was a breacher. He also had been deployed to both Afghanistan and Iraq. Did some back-to-back tours. And had some wicked blast exposures. Also had an impact exposure where he was concussed, and then he had a number of the training to go through that is kind of what we started focusing in on. And it was really when Frank came to me, his swim buddy Joe Kernan, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, a mentor of mine, CO of mine, a commanding officer of mine at Development Group. who came to see me when after it's a longer story for another time, and on what we needed to do to get after this piece. And what we found out with Ryan and Ryan's suicide, they looked at his brain post-mortem. Dr. Pearl from at the time they've changed name, University USHS, the University of Science Health Services, in the brain bank there in Walter Reed. And they looked at Brian's brain and they found this scarring on his brain that could not be seen by current neuroimaging techniques. Called interface astroglial scarring. And basically, in a layman's term, anywhere where the fluid densities were different in the head, there was this microscopic scarring. And it wasn't from impact. Compared to the other brains that Dr. Pearl had looked at that had CTE, this was not CTE. And so he had about 4 or 5 SEAL brains that had this unique scarring. And 2 of them didn't have the CT, and 2 of those did. 2 of those, the old that had CT, were older cohorts, and they had also had a history of physical sports before coming into the military. Wrestling, football, those types of things that you and I have talked about a number of times. So we said there wasn't a current diagnostic, and there wasn't really a current sort of treatment. And we just said, how can we get after this? And so we really looked at this. Ironically, the DoD policy was that for anyone that was deploying to do this neurocognitive assessment called the ANAM. And I didn't know it, so we started. I said, let's do this. We're going to baseline. We're just going to baseline everybody. We're just going to figure it out. It's not the best tool data-wise, but it was the only tool that was giving us some feedback. And I said, will this tool be able to give us data and metrics that we'll be able to use in the future if we go to a better tool that's measuring cognitively? And it was a hard sell to the community because as you can imagine, these guys that love their mission and love their teammates were afraid that the initiative was to take folks offline or not to train as hard as we were training. And that was not it at all. It was really to kind of understand the disease, what was happening, and be able to return them to duty quicker, keep them online, extend their service life, and ensure they had a good quality of life post-service. Because in 2 of those cases that I mentioned of those brains, those guys were post-career. And so the effects of these invisible wounds later. So when Ryan was seen, and it's a long and difficult story, and I don't want to steal Frank's story here, but he was really not. I won't say he's misdiagnosed. He was imprecisely diagnosed because they couldn't see an injury on neuroimaging. They treated him with psychotropic drugs for PTS, right, for post-traumatic stress. And we believe, at the time of Ryan's suicide, I don't have the exact number, but Frank, would. There were 20 prescribed drugs, on his nightside table that he was taking post-service, and really kind of put out of the service based on his issues. We believe that we started to suspect that maybe, this comorbidity of what we found in Dr. Pearl's studies with a physical injury to the brain, a real damage to the brain, and being treated more and there was probably some psychological things as well, but being treated as this condition, that maybe the psychotropic drugs were actually agitating some of the things going on in Brian's life, the impulsivity, the anger, and some of the other things that were the reasons that we kind of had to move away from Ryan's service. And but coming back to NSW, so I said we're just going to do this, and the senior enlisted were fighting me really, really hard. And if you want something done in special operations, you got to get the senior enlisted on board. Much like it was with human performance and physical performance, way back in the early 80s and the early 2000s. And it was easy for them to get on board with that because they could see the results and you could measure them. we couldn't see the injury and we couldn't measure it, right? So
hence invisible wounds, right?
Right, the invisible wounds. So I had this commander's call where I brought all the major commanders in. That's the 06, like the captain or colonel level, in the Army, captain level in the Navy, and they're senior enlisted. And I just had the ANAM team come in from the academy in San Antonio on the computer, so that was all sort of controlled in that we were all on the same machines and that type of thing. And we took the test. And true special operations fashion, as soon as we started taking the tests, there's like 16 tests on speed and reactivity and short-term memory. It became a competition, right? So everyone was competing like it was a shooting competition or the obstacle. And it was like, okay, I know we're going to make this happen. And so, fast forward, I baseline all the SEALs and SWCS. That's the SWCS are our combatant craft, our fast boat drivers and crews in the community in less than a year. And when I was, coming to the end of my term as the commander there, General Thomas at SOCOM, Special Operations Command, asked me to come to special, to SOCOM and do kind of the same thing for him under their POTF, which was their POTF line of funding is all about human performance. And it's it's preserve the force and the families. And it's a congressionally funded line for human performance. And at the time, cognitive was kind of just tucked up under mental and psychological, as it's in this weird, mix of, and I really wanted to separate that out because I thought the cognitive aspects were different than the mental health, different than the social and psychological piece. And they're like, well, we're gonna struggle with Congress. And I said, I don't think we are. I think we have a good story to tell here. And that's kind of where it's been for me for the last 2 years in Naval Special Warfare and my last 3 years in Special Operations Command. I know that was long, Phil, but that's what got me started in, along the journey of brain health, particularly cognitive brain health.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting piece as I listen, right, is how important when you are presenting change and policy, you've got to garner the trust and support both up and down and laterally across the organization. You mentioned the senior enlisted folks, that's the key. They're leading the front lines, right? They have to buy in any organization. Those frontline managers, or in your case, the senior enlisted, and trust is such a critical component of that. And as I listen, a lot of it is nomenclature, where it's bucketed, right? And so rather than saying, hey, mental health, you're talking cognitive health, right? And therefore cognitive health belongs under human performance, and
right.
And that's in a way, I think, what garnered some of the competitiveness around adopting that type of baseline, right?
Absolutely. No, you've nailed it. You nailed it on I think on two fronts. One, the trust aspect, and the down and up. So once you got the buy for the down is important for implementation, right? But the lateral is important, and you can move that. That's sheer force of personality and leadership. And then the advocacy to educate and inform the next level up for money, and that's right, the money side, as well as policy. And I'll tell you, I think policy has done a great job in DoD over the last few years. Congress is we've got some true advocates. Shout out to Joni Ernst for sure. In supporting brain health initiatives, but the reality is it's hard still with invisible wounds, and the understanding of if we optimize cognitive performance, what will that do for organizational effectiveness? Combat readiness, and I think as we think about near peer competitors that are what we may have to face in the future. Special DoD writ large, but special operations for sure, is we're going to need a more cognitively enhanced warrior. So this is not just about taking care of the injured. This is we've got a lot of injured, and we've got a lot of folks we need to treat. But it's also how do we prepare the force, for the future, and how do we get, again, we'll come back to the eke word. How do we eke the most when we're just so fine tuned on human performance? How can we get just a little bit more? And I think the cognitive area is where that lies.
Yeah, it's always marrying that retention with the acute performance, that, trying to find those windows of the short term and long term and where they intersect. I think cognitive health is, the way you're describing it, is such a big piece to that. What, as you look kind of the future, where do you see, the needs, or, the growth, and where it needs to kind of continue in this space?
Yeah, I think professional sports analogy or not even professional and amateur sports analogy or current events is a real good indicator of where we could be, right? I look, and just this week, I look at someone like Simone Biles, who, came back after whether it was perceived or real, her twisties, and her doubt, self-doubt, and maybe some cognitive, whether it's mental health or cognitive, but, to come back and win her 8th national title at the age of 26, to see Michaela Schifrin this year become the all-time alpine downhill ski, ski champion, male or female, after such a poor performance at the Olympics last time, she was suffering a little bit from her father's death and some things going on in her life, more recently. And all the professional athletes that are dealing with their mental health, but also guys like Brady and LeBron, who, are taking the cognitive aspect and the mental health aspect as important to their training regime as it is their nutrition, their physical health, and their sleep. And I've talked about sleep, a number of times, but I just think this aspect of the cognitive piece, and then this nexus of where we can be with cognitive and accelerated ways of training, where we can get repetition without risk in sort of the virtual world. Tom Brady does this, these others, this aspect of stretching the mind through virtual or near virtual, without sort of the aspects of exposures to the head, whether that's concussion or others. And I just think that gives us a good path to think about where we need to go in the military on approaching training and human performance through improving and optimizing brain health.
Yeah, I love that term you used in there, repetitions without risk. Reps without risk is such a great way to frame the pursuit of cognitive health. And I think the opportunities for the future of, how you can continue to improve this area and make it more part of the framework of, that's what we do. Just like we go for a run, just like we lift. Now we do our cognitive reps, our reps without risk, because I think almost in a way, internal marketing, helps within an organization sell it down, lateral and up, as to why it's so important.
Yeah. One thing I didn't mention, but as you just replayed that for me, Phil, it becomes important. I think that what the other thing they're doing is they're taking breaks, right? And I think we're still going to have to strip down the military taboos of. I'm kind of drifting in more to the mental health perspective here. I think we can strengthen and optimize the cognitive piece just in the way we train, right? That one I think is going to be easy to optimize. This aspect of the mental health piece that I think becomes important is how do you, much like a physical injury, how do you give somebody some time off, and how do they stand up and say, I actually am injured, and still need the rehabilitation, the great rehabilitation techniques that you've given me to put me back online physically, to do that either cognitively or mentally. And the taboos in the military still don't allow us. And some of that's policies about the scare of losing your security clearance or losing your readiness, which involves pays, which is always important. But those are easy to change policies. And I think if we look to the sports world and see how either by themselves or the teams and coaches and infrastructure, the ownership around them, allowing them the time to take off and recover much like they would for putting someone on the injured reserve or a player unfit to perform, in the NFL. For the same things, for them to come back stronger, and we're seeing them coming back stronger and more capable. Is something that the military, I think, should adopt and probably will adopt over time. For retention, for readiness, I think it'll become really important. But we have a long way to go on kind of stripping down the military taboos.
Yeah, and I think every organization for leaders that are listening has those taboos, and I think as we could continue talking, and there's just a host of knowledge on your end, but I know your time is short and valuable, so I always like to kind of summarize takeaways for the leaders that are listening. And I think one big piece for me is the first place is there's invisible wounds in any organization, and the place to start, which you've done and implemented, is baselining. The data collection, it may not be perfect, but we've got to start baselining, because just because something's invisible doesn't mean it's not actually happening and could happen and impact at a later date. And so that baselining of invisible wounds is the right place to start. And it's not going to be perfect, but you got to start. And I think the second piece is, how important it is to engage all the stakeholders, right? You talked about the senior enlisted, getting them to buy in first to implement it. Then ultimately every leader's got to find the resourcing and the funding. So you've got to extend that leadership upwards, and the terms and the language that's used is key. And related to that, I think the third takeaway for me is how important, the language and the where it fits in the budget line items, if you will, right? And that cognitive is a piece of human performance, and particularly as the Army and the workforce and the armed forces in general are struggling with retention of employees, of warfighters, of athletes. If you're struggling with retention, that cognitive health is a big piece to improve that retention.
I think you nailed it all three. Yeah. Because the baselining was so sort of inherent for me, I always forget to sort of kind of stress the baselining. Yeah, because I think it is important and I think eventually
people want to jump to solutions, though, right?
That's right.
You got a baseline first before you start shooting. Yeah,
that's right. Yep. Like and anything else we do, that baseline becomes, and we may have it completely off mark, but we'll know that soon, right? And then we'll shift the way we are baselining, or we'll improve the way we're baselining.
Yeah.
I think you nailed it all three, though.
Well, I continue to learn. So thanks for your time, Tim.
Yeah, Phil, I really enjoyed today. Thanks, Sparta. Thank you to you. And sorry if I rambled on a few of those, but
not at all.
I'm very passionate about brain health and where we need to go.
Absolutely.